I heard my son discuss my house before I could open my eyes. That's the simplest way I know to say it. Even now, when I repeat it to myself, it sounds strange. Not dramatic, just strange. Like something that belonged in someone else's life, not mine. The room smelled like antiseptic and warmed plastic. There was a soft mechanical beeping somewhere to my left, steady enough that after a while it stopped sounding like a machine and started sounding like a clock. Not a normal clock. Something flatter than that, more patient. At first I thought I was dreaming. I couldn't move. I couldn't even tell where my hands were, but I could hear things. Footsteps, a rolling cart, fabric brushing against itself, voices drifting in and out, the way sounds do when you're half asleep and half somewhere else. A nurse said my name once, Miss Parker. Then another voice corrected her, Mrs. Parker. I remember that because it irritated me. My husband had been gone nearly 30 years, and I still got called Mrs. Parker in hospitals and billing offices and waiting rooms, as if widowhood was just a paperwork delay no one felt like correcting. At the time, I didn't think much of it. Later, I realized that small irritation was one of the first signs my mind was still working quietly behind everything else. I don't know how many days passed before I heard my son clearly. Maybe 3, maybe 10. Time in that place didn't move in straight lines. It pooled, it stretched, it thinned out and disappeared. But I knew his voice. Even softened by exhaustion, even carrying that careful tone people use in hospitals, I knew it was Michael. He was standing close to the bed. I could tell by the way his voice landed, not echoing through the room, just falling directly toward me. She wouldn't want this, he said. There was a pause after that. The kind of pause people leave in a sentence when they're waiting for someone else to confirm what they've already decided. Then I heard Jessica, my daughter-in-law. Her voice had always been neat. That's the word I'd use for it. Neat. Even when she said something unpleasant, it arrived polished, like it had already been arranged into the most reasonable shape. We have to be practical, she said. The doctors have been clear. No, they hadn't. I knew that even then, somewhere in that fog, between sleep and waking, doctors rarely say things as clearly as families repeat them later. They leave space. They use words like possible and unlikely, and will continue monitoring. People fill in the rest with whatever they already want to believe. I tried to say something. I'm still here. Nothing happened. My mouth didn't move. My hands didn't move. Even my breathing felt like it belonged to someone else. Then I heard a chair scrape slightly across the floor, and Michael lowered his voice. What about the house? It wasn't loud. It wasn't angry. It wasn't even emotional. And that was the part that stayed with me. Not because he yelled, because he didn't. Because somewhere in his mind, while I lay in a hospital bed, unable to lift a finger, my house had already become something that could be discussed. The house wasn't large. It never had been. A small brick place in Oak Creek, 2 bedrooms, a narrow front porch, and a backyard just big enough for a tree and a table. I bought it after years of catering work and cleaning houses and ironing shirts for families who treated polished silver like it proved something about them. It took 16 years to save enough for the down payment. Longer, if you count the years I spent learning how to stretch money so tightly, it stopped feeling like money and started feeling like muscle. That house was never just property to me. It was evidence. Evidence that hard years could eventually become something solid. Jessica answered him carefully, like she had already practiced the sentence somewhere else. It's empty, she said. And my parents need somewhere stable for a while. We can't keep pretending nothing has to be decided. That's when the room went quiet. Not literally. Machines were still beeping. Shoes still passed in the hallway. Somewhere a drawer slid shut. But inside me, something settled into place with a kind of cold clarity. Some people mistake silence for permission. I didn't think the sentence in those exact words at the time, but the meaning was there. The shape of it. My whole life, people had described me as reasonable, helpful, not difficult. I was the woman who brought extra casserole when someone's husband lost a job. The one who stayed after church dinners stacking chairs. The one who listened first and spoke second. I had worn that kind of womanhood so long it fit like skin. And lying there, unable to move, I understood something I should have understood much earlier. A calm woman is not the same thing as an unguarded one. Michael exhaled through his nose, the way he does when he's already halfway into a decision and wants someone else to finish the second half for him. He did that as a boy, too, before asking for money for a school trip. Before admitting he'd dented the car in college. Before telling me he planned to marry Jessica after knowing her less than a year. I could hear that same breath now. "What if she wakes up?" he asked. Jessica didn't answer right away. "That mattered more than anything," she eventually said, "because a decent person answers that question immediately. Then we help her recover. Then we apologize for even discussing this. Then we act like family." Jessica took her time. "If she wakes up," she said finally, "we'll deal with what's practical then." Practical. There are words people use when they want betrayal to sound administrative. Practical is one of them. A few minutes later, someone entered the room. A nurse, I think. Young voice, soft shoes. She asked a question about medication. Papers rustled. A monitor tone shifted slightly. Michael and Jessica immediately switched to their public voices, the ones people use in hospitals and schools and bank offices, when they want to sound cooperative without actually giving anything up. I remember another detail too. A faint smell of burnt coffee drifting in from somewhere down the hall, probably the nurse's station. The door had opened briefly and the smell floated in. For some reason, that smell fixed the moment in place for me. The monitor, Jessica's polished voice, my son discussing my house as if I had already become a framed photograph. That was the first detail I held on to. The house had entered the conversation too early, before recovery, before discharge, before any decent person should have gone there. And once I noticed that, I started listening differently. Not like a patient, like a witness. The next time Michael came in alone, I heard him speaking quietly into his phone before he reached the bed. "No," he said. "Not a sale, not yet. I said I'd look into it." There was silence for a moment. Then he added, "I know what Jessica wants." He ended the call before the other person could answer loudly enough for me to hear them. At the time, I didn't know who he had been speaking to. Later, I would. That moment mattered more than I understood then, because by that point it was no longer just a son in shock saying the wrong thing at the wrong time. There was already a process forming around me, quietly, efficiently. The kind of process people begin when they believe the person at the center of it will not be returning to object. I lay there and did the only thing I could do. I stayed still. I listened. And somewhere behind the numbness and the medication and the strange drifting darkness, I made a decision that surprised even me. If I came back, and at that point, I still didn't know if I would. I was not going to scream. I was not going to beg. I was not going to argue from a hospital bed with people who had already shown me how quickly they could reorganize my life around my absence. I was going to find out exactly what they had started. And then I was going to answer it with procedure. I didn't wake up the next day, or the day after that. Memory from that period doesn't move in clear steps. It drifts. Sounds appear, then fade again. Time stretches in ways that are hard to measure. Later, when I tried to piece it together, it felt less like remembering and more like sorting through fragments that had been floating around for weeks. One of the first fragments that stayed with me was the sound of rain against the hospital window. I don't know what day it was, but I remember the rhythm clearly. A slow, steady tapping against the glass, somewhere behind my bed. The kind of rain that settles over a city and stays there for hours. The room felt quieter that morning. Fewer voices in the hallway. The machines beside my bed seemed louder than usual, as if the rest of the building had stepped away for a moment. A nurse came in and checked something near my arm. "Still stable," she said softly to someone behind her. That was the first word I understood clearly in days. Stable. It meant my body had decided not to leave yet. Not long after that, Michael came again. I recognized his steps before he spoke. My son had always walked quickly, even when he was a boy. Light steps, almost impatient, like he was always trying to arrive somewhere just a little earlier than everyone else. That day, his steps sounded heavier, slower. He pulled the chair beside the bed closer. The legs scraped quietly across the floor. "Mum," he said. He always used that word when he wanted something. Not ma, not mother. Just ma. Followed by a small pause, like the rest of the sentence needed permission to arrive. At the time, I didn't think much of that pause. Later, I realized it had always been a warning. He sat there for a moment without speaking again. I could hear his breathing. "They're saying there's no change," he said finally. Another pause. "I don't know how long we're supposed to keep doing this." A chair shifted behind him. "Jessica." "I already told you," she said, her voice calm and organized the way it always was. "The hospital can't keep someone indefinitely without decisions being made." Decisions. That word again. Michael didn't answer right away. I don't want to do something I can't undo," he said. Jessica let out a small breath, not loud enough to sound angry, just enough to signal impatience. "You're not undoing anything," she replied. "You're accepting reality." That sentence settled into the room and stayed there for several seconds. Then she said something that caught my attention immediately. "Have you talked to the notary yet?" Notary. That word settled in my mind like a small stone. At the time, I couldn't move. I couldn't open my eyes. I couldn't even shift my hands beneath the blanket, but my mind held on to that word carefully. Michael lowered his voice. "Not yet." "You said you would," Jessica said. "I said I'd look into it." "That's not the same thing." Michael exhaled slowly. The same breath I had heard earlier. "I just want to understand exactly what we're allowed to do." Jessica's voice didn't soften. "You're her son. That already answers most of the questions." "No," I thought. "It doesn't." But I couldn't say that yet. The rain against the window had slowed by then. Somewhere in the hallway, a cart rolled past, its wheels rattling briefly across the floor. Jessica spoke again, this time with a little more edge beneath the neatness. "My parents can't stay in that apartment forever." Michael didn't answer. "So what's the alternative?" she continued. "They move again in 6 months? We just keep waiting for something that might never change?" Michael rubbed his hands together. I could hear the quiet friction of his palms. "I just want everything done correctly," he said. Jessica repeated the word as if testing it. "Correctly." Then she added, very calmly, "That's exactly what the notary is for." There was another long silence, and then she said something that would matter much later. "The paperwork already has your name on it." Paperwork. Another stone added to the small pile forming in my mind. Notary. Paperwork. And my house already moving through conversations as if I had quietly stepped out of it. A nurse entered the room a few minutes later, interrupting whatever answer Michael might have given. "Visiting hours are ending soon," she said gently. Jessica stood immediately. Her heels clicked lightly against the floor. Michael hesitated for a moment. "I'll come back tomorrow," he said softly toward the bed. Then they left. The door closed behind them. The room returned to its quiet pattern of machine sounds and distant hallway voices. That was the moment something inside me shifted. Not emotionally. Emotion would come later. This shift was quieter than that. I started listening differently. Not like a patient, like someone reviewing evidence. Over the next several days, maybe weeks, I still can't say I began noticing patterns. Michael visited less often. Jessica came almost every time he did. Sometimes she spoke on her phone near the door before approaching the bed. Once I heard her say, "Yes, we're working on it." Another time, "No, the title hasn't changed yet." And another, "He's handling the signatures." Signatures. That word joined the others. Notary. paperwork, signatures. At some point, a doctor entered the room while Michael was present. His voice carried the calm distance doctors learn to maintain when families are waiting for answers. Your mother's condition is stable, he said. But neurological recovery is unpredictable, Michael asked quietly. Is there any sign she can hear us? The doctor paused. We can't rule it out. That's when the room went quiet again. Jessica shifted in her chair. Well, she said after a moment, if she can hear us, she would want us to do what's responsible. Responsible. Another tidy word added to the vocabulary forming around my hospital bed. Later that evening, after they had gone, a nurse stayed beside my bed a little longer while adjusting something on the IV line. You're stronger than you look, Mrs. Parker, she murmured, almost to herself. I couldn't answer her, but I held on to that sentence, because by then something had become very clear. The conversations around me were not about grief, they were about timing. And somewhere outside that hospital room, paperwork had already begun moving in directions I had never approved. The first time I moved my finger happened not long after that. Just slightly, barely enough to shift the sheet. But it was enough to tell me something important. My body had started returning. And when it did, I was going to need every detail I had been quietly collecting. Because some people mistake silence for permission, but procedure doesn't recognize silence. The first time I opened my eyes, the ceiling looked like it was moving. It took a few seconds to realize the movement wasn't the ceiling. It was my vision adjusting, light spreading slowly across surfaces that had probably been there the entire time. The ceiling was plain hospital white. A small air vent sat above the door, and a fluorescent panel hummed softly overhead. A nurse noticed almost immediately. Oh, she said, surprised but calm. Mrs. Parker? I tried to answer. What came out was a dry whisper that barely sounded like a word. Water appeared. A straw. A careful hand supporting the back of my neck. Take your time, she said gently. That phrase, take your time, became the rhythm of the next several days. Everything happened slowly. Muscles remembered their jobs in small pieces. My hands shook when I tried to hold a cup. My legs didn't trust the floor at first. Even my voice needed practice, like an old radio signal adjusting back to its proper frequency. But my mind was clear. Clearer, actually, than it had been in years. Illness does that sometimes. It strips away the smaller concerns that usually fill your days. When you come back from something like that, the unimportant things fall away very quickly. But the important things become sharper. And I knew, even before Michael walked into the room that first afternoon, that the important question wasn't my recovery. It was what had been happening while I couldn't speak. Michael arrived alone. He stopped in the doorway when he saw my eyes open. For a moment, he looked almost like the boy he used to be, startled, uncertain, trying to understand something larger than himself. Mom? He said quietly. I nodded. That was all the strength I had at the time. He stepped closer, relief spreading across his face. Thank God, he said. We thought. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't hug me either. That detail stayed with me. Jessica came in a few minutes later, moving quickly, her coat still on as if she hadn't planned to stay long. Well, she said, glancing at the monitors. That's unexpected. Unexpected. I noticed the word immediately. During that visit, I watched both of them carefully. Michael stayed close to the bed. Jessica stayed near the door. Neither of them mentioned the house. Neither mentioned paperwork. Neither mentioned notaries or signatures or practical decisions. Instead, they talked about doctors, physical therapy, discharge timelines. The performance was almost convincing. But once you've heard people speak when they believe you're gone, it becomes very difficult to forget that version of them. A doctor came in shortly afterward. He introduced himself as Dr. Patel, a neurologist with calm eyes and a voice that never rushed through explanations. You've made remarkable progress, he told me. Your recovery will continue over the next few weeks. Michael nodded gratefully beside the bed. Jessica checked her phone. Doctor, Patel continued, scrolling through something on his tablet. There are a few administrative matters we'll need to confirm as well. Administrative, another word that had already been circling quietly around my life. What kind of matters? Michael asked. Routine authorization documents, the doctor said. Treatment approvals, billing signatures, family consent forms. Michael stiffened slightly. Dr. Patel looked up. You've been signing on your mother's behalf during her coma, he said calmly. Yes, Michael replied. Of course. The doctor nodded. That's common for immediate family. But now that Mrs. Parker is conscious, we'll transition those authorizations back to her directly. Jessica's phone stopped moving in her hand. Michael cleared his throat. Right, he said. Of course, Dr. Patel turned toward me. Once you're feeling stronger, we'll review those forms together. I nodded. Inside, something settled into place. The paperwork already had your name on it. Jessica's earlier sentence echoed quietly in my memory. After they left that afternoon, a hospital social worker stopped by. Her name was Karen Thompson, mid-40s. Sensible haircut, a folder tucked under one arm like she carried it everywhere. She spoke gently, but directly. I just want to confirm a few things for your records, she said. We went through the usual questions first. Emergency contact, insurance provider, pharmacy. Then she turned to another page. There are also property authorization forms here, she said. Your son indicated he had temporary legal authority during your hospitalization. That was the moment the room shifted. Not emotionally, procedurally. What kind of authority? I asked slowly. Karen adjusted her glasses. A limited power of attorney document filed through a notary. There it was again. Notary. One of the small details I had been holding on to since the coma. At the time, she continued, it allowed your son to make certain administrative decisions while you were incapacitated. I took a breath. May I see it? She hesitated only briefly before opening the folder. The document was simple. 2 pages, typed, stamped. My name appeared 3 times. The signature at the bottom looked almost like mine. Almost. At the time, I didn't say anything. I simply studied the page. Somewhere down the hall, a phone rang. A nurse laughed softly with another staff member. The hospital continued moving around us as if nothing unusual had happened. Karen waited patiently. Is something wrong? She asked. I closed the folder. No, I said calmly. At the time, I didn't think much of it. Later, I realized that moment mattered more than I understood. Because the signature wasn't the only thing on the page, near the bottom was a reference to a second document. Property usage authorization. My house. I handed the folder back to her. When was this filed? I asked. Karen checked the date. 3 months ago. 3 months. 3 months, while I lay in that hospital bed, listening to fragments of conversations through the fog. Michael had not simply talked about my house. He had already begun moving it through procedure. Karen smiled politely. Once you're discharged, we can update any authorizations you'd like to change. I nodded. Yes, I said quietly. We will. That night, lying in the hospital bed, staring at the ceiling again, I thought about the sentence Jessica had used. Practical. And I thought about another sentence that had begun forming slowly in my mind while I lay there listening. Authority doesn't come from speaking first. It comes from being the one who signs last. Leaving the hospital was quieter than I expected. There was no dramatic moment, no sense of ceremony. Just a wheelchair, a clipboard, and a nurse reminding me to watch the curb when the automatic doors opened. The air outside smelled like wet pavement and autumn leaves. Chicago had moved forward 6 months while I had been lying under fluorescent lights. Cars passed. A bus stopped at the corner. Somewhere nearby, someone was laughing. At the time, I didn't think much of it. Later, I realized that first breath of outside air was the moment I fully stepped back into my own life. Michael drove me home. He insisted on it, which surprised me slightly. For most of the drive, he kept both hands on the steering wheel and looked straight ahead, the way people do when they're concentrating on staying inside their lane. Jessica sat in the passenger seat, scrolling through her phone. No one mentioned the house. That silence felt almost polite. But it was the kind of politeness people use when everyone in the car knows a subject exists, and no one wants to be the first person to bring it up. The drive took about 40 minutes. As we moved through the streets, familiar places began appearing again. The grocery store where I used to shop on Wednesdays, the pharmacy where I picked up my prescriptions, a gas station that had repainted its sign while I was gone. Normal life had continued without asking my permission. When we turned onto my street, I noticed the first change immediately. A black SUV sat in my driveway, not Michael's car, not any car I recognized. Michael slowed slightly as we pulled in. "They're here," Jessica said casually. I didn't answer. Michael parked behind the SUV and got out first. He walked around and opened my door, steadying my arm as I stepped onto the pavement. My legs still felt unreliable, but they remembered the path to my front porch. Halfway up the steps, I stopped. The front door was green. I had painted that door myself 20 years earlier, deep red. It had taken 3 coats and most of a Saturday afternoon. Green had never been part of the plan. At the time, I didn't say anything. Jessica walked ahead and opened the door. "Mum!" a voice called from inside. Frank Miller appeared in the hallway wearing slippers and a flannel shirt. "Emily?" he said warmly. "Good to see you up again." Behind him, Sarah Miller stepped out of the kitchen holding a dish towel. "You must still be tired," she said. "We tried to keep everything comfortable for when you came back." Comfortable. That word joined practical and responsible in the quiet vocabulary of this situation. I stepped inside slowly. The first thing I noticed was the smell. My house had always smelled faintly like cinnamon and furniture polish. Years of baking pies had done that. Even when I wasn't cooking, the scent stayed in the wood. Now the air smelled like lavender detergent. The living room had changed. My floral couch was gone. In its place sat a wide leather sofa facing a television mounted on the wall where my bookshelf used to be. My wooden coffee table had been replaced with a glass one. Family photographs hung above the mantel. None of them were mine. That's when the room went quiet. Frank noticed where I was looking. "We moved a few things around," he said. "Just temporary adjustments." Jessica spoke from behind me. "It made more sense this way. More sense." I walked further into the house. The kitchen looked almost familiar, except the wooden table I had painted by hand was missing. A metal table with 4 chairs stood in its place. Sarah followed me inside. "We stored your furniture safely," she explained. "In the shed out back. Everything's protected." Stored. Another tidy word. Michael stood near the doorway watching me carefully. He looked nervous. Not guilty, just nervous. There's a difference. I opened the back door and stepped onto the patio. My apple tree stood in the corner of the yard, its branches trimmed shorter than I remembered. Too short. Someone had pruned it hard. "Tree was getting wild," Frank said from the doorway. "We had someone cut it back. At the time, I didn't say anything. But later, that detail mattered more than the furniture, because that apple tree had been there longer than any of us. I planted it with Michael when he was 17. The memory came back suddenly. A warm Saturday afternoon. Dirt under my fingernails. Michael holding the thin sapling upright while I filled the hole with soil. "You sure this thing will grow?" he asked. "It will," I told him. "Trees just need time." Back in the present, the branches looked thin but alive. Small buds were forming along the cuts. Trees recover quietly. People sometimes forget that. I turned back toward the house. "Thank you for looking after things," I said calmly. Jessica blinked. Michael looked relieved. Frank nodded. "Of course." Inside, Sarah began explaining where they had placed different items. Her tone was friendly, almost helpful, but underneath it ran a quiet assumption that the house now belonged to a shared arrangement. that my return had simply added one more resident to the system they had already organized. I didn't challenge that assumption that day. Procedure takes time. Later that evening, after dinner and polite conversation, and Jessica describing which grocery store she preferred now, Michael walked me to the small bedroom they had prepared for me. It had been my sewing room once. Now a twin bed stood against the wall. My old dresser had been replaced by a narrower one. Michael stood awkwardly near the doorway. "I know this is a lot," he said. I nodded, yes, but we'll figure it out. He looked relieved again. The next morning I woke early. Habit, the house was quiet. Frank and Sarah were still asleep. Jessica had already left for work. Michael had gone back to his office downtown. I made coffee. The new machine took longer than my old one. I sat at the kitchen table and opened my laptop. Recovery had given me one unexpected advantage. Everyone believed I had just returned from 6 months of silence. No one realized I had been listening. The first thing I checked was the county property registry. Oak Creek keeps most of its records online now. It took less than 3 minutes to locate my address. Owner, Emily Parker. No transfer recorded. That was interesting. Because if someone believed they had moved into my house legally, there should have been documentation. I searched again. Then I noticed something. A secondary filing from 3 months earlier. Property usage authorization. Signed under temporary power of attorney, Michael Parker. That's when everything changed. Because the document didn't transfer ownership, it did something quieter. It granted temporary occupancy rights to another party. Frank Miller. Sarah Miller. 2 years. Rent-free, filed through a local notary office. I sat there looking at the screen for a long moment. Outside, a garbage truck rolled slowly down the street. Normal life continued. I took a sip of coffee. Authority doesn't come from saying something first. It comes from knowing exactly which document allowed the situation to exist. And once I understood that document, I knew where the next step needed to happen. The next morning, I drove downtown. Not far. 15 minutes if the traffic lights cooperated. My legs were still a little unsteady from the stroke, but the doctor had said movement would help the recovery, and I've always been someone who prefers doing something to sitting still. At the time, I didn't think much of that drive. Later, I realized it was the moment my role in the situation quietly shifted. Up until then, I had been the subject of decisions. Now I was going to review them. The notary office, listed on the document, sat on the second floor of a narrow brick building near the county courthouse. A small brass plaque beside the door read, Henderson Legal Services, Notary and Document Authentication. Inside, the office smelled faintly of printer ink and carpet cleaner. A reception desk sat near the window with a neat stack of folders beside the keyboard. A woman in her 30s looked up from her computer. "Good morning," she said politely. "Good morning," I replied. "I believe a document was notarized here a few months ago involving my name. I'd like to review the record." She nodded and began typing. Name? Emily Parker. She paused slightly when she entered it into the system. Then she looked back up. 1 moment. The pause lasted longer than a routine search usually would. After a minute, she stood and walked into a small office behind the desk. I heard quiet conversation through the door. A chair rolled slightly across the floor. A drawer opened. A few moments later, a man stepped out, mid-50s, grey hair, calm expression. "I'm David Henderson," he said. "You're Mrs. Parker?" "Yes." He gestured toward a chair across from his desk. "Please, sit." There's a particular tone professionals use when something is slightly off, but they're still deciding how serious it might be. His voice carried that tone. He opened a file on the desk. "Your name appears on a power of attorney document we notarized in February." "Yes," I said. "I'd like to see the original." He turned the page toward me. The document looked exactly like the copy I had seen at the hospital. 2 pages, typed, stamped. Signature. Except this time I could see the notary seal clearly. And I could see the witness signature. Jessica Miller. Mr. Henderson folded his hands on the desk. "Mrs. Parker," he said calmly. Were you present in this office on February 12th? No. He nodded slowly. That's what I suspected. He rotated the document again and tapped the bottom line. The person who appeared here identified herself as you. That's when the room went quiet. Not dramatically quiet. Just the kind of pause that happens when the meaning of a sentence needs a moment to settle between two people. I see, I said. Mr. Henderson leaned back slightly. Fraudulent identity at a notary office is taken seriously, he continued. But I want to clarify something before we go further. He tapped the second page again. This document did not transfer ownership of your property. I know. It granted temporary authority. Yes. He studied me for a moment. You're remarkably calm. I smiled faintly. I had several months to listen to the conversations that led to this. His eyebrows lifted slightly. I see. He turned the page again. The power of attorney allowed your son to file a property usage authorization with the county registry. Yes. That authorization allows the Miller family to occupy your home for 2 years. I nodded. I've read it. He closed the file. Technically, he said, the authorization remains valid unless the power of attorney is formally revoked. I waited. Then he added the sentence I had expected. And revocation must be filed by the original principal. In other words, me. For a moment, I didn't say anything. Instead, I opened my bag and removed a folder. Inside were 2 documents. My hospital discharge papers, and the neurologist's certification confirming my mental competency after the stroke. Mr. Henderson read them carefully. Then he nodded. Well, he said calmly, that simplifies things. He pulled a blank document from a drawer. Revocation of power of attorney. The form took less than 10 minutes to complete. Name, address, reference to the original document, signature. When I finished signing, he stamped the page with the notary seal. The sound of that stamp echoed slightly in the quiet office. That revocation becomes effective immediately, he said. I nodded. What happens next? He slid the completed document into the folder. Next, we notify the county registry. He typed for a moment, printed a confirmation sheet, and handed it to me. This filing voids the authority your son used to authorize the Miller family's occupancy. I read the page carefully. Then, I asked the obvious question. What about the occupancy agreement itself? Mr. Henderson folded his hands again. That's where things become procedural. Procedural. Another word that had quietly followed this situation from the beginning. Explain, I said. The occupancy authorization your son filed was legal only because the power of attorney existed at the time. Yes. Once the power of attorney is revoked, the authorization loses its legal foundation. He paused slightly. In other words, it collapses. I nodded slowly. And the people living in the house? Technically, he said, they become occupants without valid authorization. That was the first clear institutional confirmation. Quiet, precise. Not emotional, just procedure. He continued speaking. You have several options: eviction, civil complaint, negotiated departure. I looked down at the document again. Outside the office window, someone pushed a cart stacked with courthouse files across the sidewalk. Traffic moved slowly along the street. Normal life continuing. Inside the folder, the document that had allowed my house to be occupied had already started unraveling. Some people believe authority comes from speaking loudly, from announcing decisions first, but real authority usually comes from something smaller. A line on a document, a seal pressed into paper, a signature placed in the correct space. And now the structure built around my silence had lost the signature it depended on. Mr. Henderson looked up again. What would you like to do next, Mrs. Parker? I closed the folder. I think, I said calmly. It's time to review the county filing office. The county records office sits 2 blocks from the courthouse, in a square concrete building that looks exactly like the kind of place where paperwork quietly changes people's lives. Inside, the air carried the faint smell of paper, old toner, and floor polish. 3 service windows lined the front wall. A row of plastic chairs waited along the side, occupied by people holding folders and envelopes. I walked to the small ticket machine and pressed the button. A slip of paper appeared. B. 219. The electronic board above the counter read B. 214. At the time, I didn't think much of the wait. Just 5 numbers between me and the clerk. Later, I realized those few minutes gave me space to consider what the next step would actually do. Up until then, everything had been verification, listening, checking, confirming. The next step would begin changing the structure Michael and Jessica believed they had built. When my number appeared, I stepped to the counter. A clerk wearing silver reading glasses looked up from her screen. "Good morning," she said. "Good morning," I replied. "I need to update a property authorization tied to this address." I slid the folder across the counter. She opened it and scanned the first page. "Revocation of power of attorney," she read quietly. Her eyes moved down the document. Then she turned back to her keyboard. The keys clicked softly for several seconds. "Yes," she said finally. "I see the occupancy authorization here." She rotated the screen slightly so I could see the record. Property usage authorization, temporary occupancy filed. February 14, authorized occupants. Frank Miller, Sarah Miller, authorized by Michael Parker, power of attorney. She adjusted her glasses again. "And the revocation was filed this morning." "Yes." The clerk nodded slowly. "That changes things." The room seemed to pause for a moment, not dramatically. Just the small silence people leave before explaining something that will shift the situation. She printed a document and slid it toward me. "This filing removes the legal authority supporting the occupancy agreement." I read the page carefully. "Meaning?" I asked. She tapped the bottom paragraph with her pen. "Meaning the property reverts to full control of the registered owner. Emily Parker." My name sat there calmly in black letters. The clerk continued. "The occupants will need to establish a new legal agreement with you or vacate the property." At the time, I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I signed the acknowledgement line. She stamped the document. The sound echoed slightly through the quiet office. Procedure moving forward. As I gathered the folder, the clerk added something that mattered more than she probably realized. "The system will automatically notify the original filing party." I paused. "Michael Parker?" "Yes." The notice would arrive by email, probably within minutes. I thanked her and stepped outside. The afternoon air had cooled slightly. Traffic moved steadily along the street. Somewhere nearby, a construction crew was cutting stone, the grinding sound bouncing off the surrounding buildings. I sat in my car for a moment before starting the engine. That pause mattered, because once the notice reached Michael's inbox, the situation would stop being theoretical. The structure he believed he had built would begin shifting. I drove back to Oak Creek slowly. When I pulled into the driveway, the black SUV was still there. Frank's slippers sat beside the front door inside. The television murmured in the living room, life continuing exactly as it had the day before. For now, Frank sat on the leather couch, watching a news channel. He looked up when I entered. "Emily," he said pleasantly. "You've been out." "Yes." "Doctor appointment?" Something like that. Sarah appeared from the kitchen holding a small plate of sliced apples. "They're from the market," she said. "The tree outside needs another season before it produces again." I glanced through the window toward the yard. The trimmed branches of my apple tree moved gently in the wind. Trees recover quietly. People sometimes forget that. Jessica arrived about 30 minutes later. Her heels clicked across the entry floor as usual. She set her purse on the counter and checked her phone. Then she stopped. Just slightly. Not enough for anyone else to notice. But I noticed. Her eyes moved across the screen twice. Then she looked toward me. "You went somewhere today," she said. "Yes." Her voice stayed controlled. I just got an email from the county registry. Michael arrived 20 minutes later. His car door slammed harder than usual outside. He walked in quickly. "Mum," he said. I looked up from the table. "Yes? The county sent me something." I imagine they did. Jessica stood beside him. Frank muted the television. Sarah placed the apple plate on the counter without speaking. Michael held up his phone. "It says the power of attorney was revoked. Yes. And the occupancy authorization is invalid. Yes." He stared at me. "You did that today." "I did." Jessica stepped forward slightly. "You can't just undo legal agreements without discussing them." I met her eyes. "Actually," I said calmly, "I can." That's when everything changed. Not emotionally, procedurally. Michael ran his hand through his hair. "My in-laws live here now. They're welcome to visit," I replied. Jessica's voice sharpened. This was already arranged, under authority that no longer exists. Michael looked between us. "You're putting us in a difficult position." I nodded. "I understand. At the time, I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse anyone of fraud. I didn't mention the notary office. Procedure rarely needs drama. It only needs time. And the structure supporting their arrangement had already begun collapsing. What Michael didn't know yet was that the revocation notice had triggered something else inside the county system, a compliance review. Because whenever a property authorization disappears suddenly, the system checks whether the occupants are still legally registered. That review would take about 48 hours. 2 days. Long enough for everyone in that house to begin realizing something important. Silence is not permission, and procedure does not forget signatures. The next 2 days passed, quietly. Quieter than I expected. There were no arguments, no raised voices, no dramatic confrontations. Just a careful stillness in the house, the kind that settles in when everyone understands. Something has shifted, but no one is quite ready to say it aloud. Jessica spent more time than usual outside on the patio with her phone. Frank watched television longer than he normally did, flipping channels without really settling on any of them. Sarah stayed in the kitchen, wiping counters that were already clean. Michael moved from room to room in a restless way, like someone trying to solve a problem that kept changing shape. At the time, I didn't say much. Recovery gave me a convenient reason for quiet, and I used it. But silence doesn't mean nothing is happening. Procedure was still moving. On the third morning, just after 9:30, the doorbell rang. Frank opened the door. A man stood on the porch wearing a grey jacket with a small county badge clipped to the pocket. "Good morning," he said calmly. "County Compliance Office." That's when the room went quiet again. Not tense, just attentive. Michael stepped forward. "Is there a problem?" The man held a thin folder under his arm. "We're conducting a routine occupancy verification related to a recent property filing change." Routine. Another calm word that can carry a great deal of weight. Michael glanced briefly toward me before turning back. "What kind of verification?" The officer stepped inside politely. "County records indicate the previous authorization allowing Mr. and Mrs. Miller to reside at this property was revoked 2 days ago." Jessica folded her arms. "That authorization was filed legally." "Yes," the officer replied. "And it was legally revoked." He opened the folder. "Which means the county must confirm the current legal occupancy status of the property." Frank shifted slightly beside the couch. "What does that mean for us?" The officer glanced down at the document. "It means the registered property owner must confirm whether the current occupants are tenants, guests, or unauthorized residents." Everyone looked toward me. I was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee. For a moment, I didn't answer. Moments like that deserve a little space. I took a sip of coffee, then set the cup down. "They are guests," I said calmly. Jessica responded immediately. "That's not accurate." The officer raised his hand slightly. "I'm not here to debate personal arrangements," he said evenly. "I'm here to confirm legal status." He turned back to me. "Mrs. Parker, are there any lease agreements or rental contracts currently in effect?" "No." Any written permission allowing permanent residency? No. He made a note on the form. In that case, the occupants are classified as temporary guests. Michael rubbed his forehead slowly. What does that change? The officer closed the folder. Guests do not have protected residency rights under County Housing Code. Jessica's voice sharpened again. So what happens now? The officer answered calmly. Nothing immediate. He looked toward me again. The property owner retains full authority over future occupancy decisions. That sentence settled into the room like a small stone dropped into still water. Authority. The word lingered quietly. Frank cleared his throat. Well, we've been here for months. The officer nodded politely. I understand. But that arrangement was based on an authorization that no longer exists. He handed me a copy of the compliance form. If the property owner decides the current guests should vacate, standard notice procedures would apply. Michael turned toward me. Mum. At the time, I didn't respond to the word, because what I noticed instead was the shift happening in the room. The certainty Jessica had carried for months was beginning to thin. Performance was fading. Panic hadn't arrived yet, but it was getting closer. The officer thanked us and left a few minutes later. The door closed behind him. No one spoke for several seconds. Finally, Jessica turned toward me. You went behind our backs, she said. I shook my head slightly. No. Michael's voice came softer. You didn't even talk to us. I didn't need to. That's when everything changed again. Not because of what I said, because of what Michael suddenly understood. You're planning to make them leave, he said. I folded my hands on the table. Michael, I said quietly, I'm planning to restore my house. Jessica laughed once, short and sharp. You think you can just erase 6 months of arrangements? I met her eyes. Procedure doesn't erase time, I said. It corrects authority. Frank looked between us, uneasily. Sarah slowly sat down in one of the chairs. Michael paced once across the kitchen floor. You're putting us in an impossible position, he said. A memory surfaced suddenly. Michael standing in this same kitchen years earlier, after denting the car when he was 19. You're putting me in an impossible position, he had said then too. And I had told him something he didn't enjoy hearing. Positions become impossible when someone makes decisions before understanding the rules. Back in the present, he stopped pacing. What do you want us to do? He asked. The house felt very still. Outside, a neighbour's dog barked twice and then went quiet again. I looked through the window toward my apple tree. Small green buds had begun opening along the branches, life moving forward slowly. You have time, I said. Use it to decide where everyone should live next. Jessica stepped closer to the table. You're serious? Yes. Michael stared at the floor. Jessica spoke again, her voice lower now. You're going to break this family apart over a technicality. I shook my head. No. I said the sentence slowly so there would be no misunderstanding. You tried to reorganize my life while I was unconscious. That's not a technicality. Michael looked up again. His voice was quieter than I had ever heard it. You heard those conversations, didn't you? I didn't answer immediately. Some questions answer themselves, because silence is not permission. And sometimes the loudest response is the one that never needs to be spoken. The house felt different after that conversation. Not louder. If anything, it became quieter. But it was the kind of quiet that carries weight. Everyone moved more carefully, as if the walls themselves had begun listening. Michael spent most of that afternoon on his phone in the driveway. Jessica moved through the house with quick, controlled steps, opening cabinets, closing drawers, checking messages. Frank and Sarah spoke to each other in low voices in the living room. At the time, I didn't interfere. Procedure has its own rhythm. Once certain steps begin, people start seeing the structure around them more clearly. By late evening, Michael came into the kitchen where I was sitting. He looked tired. Older, somehow. Mom, he said, pulling out a chair. Yes? He rested his hands on the table. You could have talked to me. I did. I said quietly. His forehead creased. When? While you were standing beside my hospital bed. He didn't answer. Instead, he looked down at the table for several seconds. I didn't think you could hear us, he said finally. I know. Jessica entered the room just then, arms folded. This isn't about hearing anything, she said. This is about control. I looked at her. No, I said calmly. It's about ownership. Michael rubbed his temples. Look, he said, trying to steady his voice. Maybe we can figure something out. What kind of arrangement? I asked. Jessica answered immediately. My parents stay here. We'll help with expenses. Everyone benefits. The sentence hung in the air for a moment. At the time, I didn't argue with the logic of it. I simply asked a different question. When was that arrangement offered to me? Jessica didn't respond. Michael leaned back in his chair. We thought you weren't coming back, he said quietly. That sentence settled into the room like dust. Not dramatic, just honest. I nodded slowly. I understand. Jessica looked relieved for a moment. Then I continued. But you were wrong. Silence returned. Michael spoke again. What happens now? I folded my hands together. Now, I said, we follow the same procedure anyone else would follow. Jessica's expression tightened. You're talking about eviction. I'm talking about notice. Frank appeared in the doorway at that moment. He had clearly been listening. Emily, he said carefully, we don't want trouble. I don't want trouble either, I replied. Sarah stood behind him. We thought Michael had the authority to make the decision. He did, I said, for a time. Jessica stepped forward again. This is exactly what I meant, she said to Michael. She's using technicalities. I looked at her. No, I said calmly. I'm using documentation. Michael leaned back in his chair again. You already knew this was coming, didn't you? Yes. How long? I thought about that for a moment. Since the hospital. That answer seemed to surprise him. Jessica shook her head. This is unbelievable. But the disbelief in her voice sounded thinner now, because the structure of the situation had already changed. The next morning, another envelope arrived. Certified mail. Michael picked it up from the mailbox and placed it on the kitchen counter. The return address read, Oak Creek County Compliance Office. He stared at it for several seconds before opening it. Inside was a printed notice, confirming the change in property authorization. The language was careful and neutral, but the meaning was clear. The previously filed occupancy authorization is no longer supported by valid power of attorney documentation. Current occupants are recognized as temporary guests of the registered property owner. Michael read the page twice. Jessica took it from his hand and read it herself. Frank adjusted his glasses and read over her shoulder. No one spoke for a long moment. Then Jessica looked up. So, what's the next step? She asked. I poured myself a cup of coffee before answering. The next step, I said, is whatever decision you make about where you would like to live. Michael looked at the paper again. You're really going to do this? I nodded. Yes. Jessica laughed quietly. You're proving my point. Which point? That this whole thing is about power. I considered that. Then I shook my head. No, I said. It's about something simpler. They waited. I looked toward the backyard window again. The apple tree moved gently in the wind. Some people believe silence means agreement, I said. But silence only lasts until the person who owns the house wakes up. No one argued after that. Because the truth had finally reached the stage where it no longer needed explanation. And procedure, once it begins tightening, rarely moves backward.